Right, now, last night I went on a little bit of a limb and I showed you a whole bunch of examples of stuff that I think is really dumb when it comes to how political communication is working, particularly on social media. Most of it starts on TikTok, but a lot of it is coming up and getting reborn in your Reels section of your Instagram. Now, there is a chance that maybe this is just my feed and I've got a little too lost in some of this stuff, but it seems pretty dumb. Like literally trying to pretend that Family Guy characters have an opinion on which way you should or shouldn't vote in the Tasmanian election, the absolute abuse that was there towards Peter Dutton in the federal election. And I got a huge number of people who sent me an email, and you can always send me one, paul@skynews.com.au, who agreed and then had their own examples of their own concerns about the type of political discussion that is being pumped out to try to, in many ways, go around the media and just try to simplify things into really good guys and bad guys. But the reality is that the world is a lot more complicated than that. For example, a Queensland budget. Now, in it is, of course, a whole series of priorities and decisions and move a little money here, spend a little more there, about things like hospitals and police and education, because, of course, state government is where so much of the rubber hits the road in actually dealing with the everyday problems. A lot of federal politics sometimes sounds like state politics because the stuff they are responsible for ends up in the too hard basket. But an example of, again, what I think is the not even dumbing down, but just the stupid not even dealing with the detail or the bare minimum detail of the stuff that we should demand of the people who write our laws or hold those people to account, was several Queensland Labor MPs who couldn't be bothered dealing with any of the details inside the Queensland budget. Instead, they wanted to complain about the colour of the books of the budget. Now, this is about as dumb as it can get when it comes to what did you think of the state budget?
Why is our state budget blue? We're supposed to be maroon. Why is the LNP trying to rebrand the whole of Queensland as blue in state of origin season? Blue budget. Ew.
And when we were working on the show tonight, I was having a chat with the team and I started to also talk about the attitudes that we have to big and complicated problems. Now, often we talk about the too hard basket and people know what that means. We know what the never, never money is. But I had one of those little moments where there was sort of lost in translation generational moment when I referred to the term she'll be right. And my wonderful, talented, passionate team didn't know where that had come from. So let me do a version on TV about a conversation we had in the offices a little bit earlier today. So what does Slim Dusty have in common with intergenerational debt, climate change, the failure to get good school results, and the number of people who are being assaulted in our communities each and every day? Well, it goes back to one of his most famous songs, which was about she'll be right. Now, for those who use this term, have heard it from their parents or grandparents, you know what she'll be right means. But for those who don't, and there's plenty, including many that will be watching us on the internet or YouTube's later than the live program that's going out right now, she'll be right essentially is don't worry about it, it'll all be okay one day. Eventually everything will be put right. It's not as bad as it seems. The musical version of this is Slim Dusty singing his song about she'll be right, mate. Bear with me, there's a point coming.
She'll be right, mate. She'll be right, that's right.
So the idea that she'll be right, it'll work out eventually, is an attitude that is fundamental to many Australians, which is to not get overwhelmed by problems. But also, it's if you put the work in, you put the effort in, then eventually the problems that are there now can be fixed. And certainly when it comes to the priorities of modern governments, a perfect example where she'll be right is not the accepted way to deal with an area of public policy is the issues in and around climate change. Now, multiple governments, multiple generations now of political conversation has been in and around this issue. But the reality is that she'll be right, it'll all work itself out. Sometimes people take to the streets or the water doing stupid things when it comes to protests. But certainly in terms of governments, they're not just sitting back and saying, sure, we're 1% of the world's problem, she'll be right, The reality is we have to do our bit for the 1%. Now, I think we do probably a little more than the 1% problem that exists, considering China is the actual problem, let alone the slave labour that they use to put into the very things that we consider to be the solution to the problem that we can't just let be, she'll be right. But the reality of that is power bills go through the roof. That's just the reality as you move from the technology that has worked for decades to the one that they, fingers crossed, hope will work to decades into the future. The reality of building that technology is hundreds of billions of dollars, nay, close to $1 trillion. So the attitude on that public policy area is she'll be right is not an okay way to deal with things. Because despite the fact that the reality of our problem is that 100% of our problem is 1% of the global problem, she'll be right is not an acceptable position to take. But funnily enough, she'll be right is something that we are too often willing to sit with when it comes to problems that are even more immediate than things like climate change. For some reason, state and federal government does take the attitude of she'll be right, mate, about things like assaults. Now, nobody says assault is okay, but think about how we are dealing with 1% of the world's climate problems versus the public debate and conversation that we have about actually bringing crime down, not by a little bit, but trying to wipe it out. Now, we know that certain crimes, the public discourse and the public conversation is we must bring it down to 0 cases of offences, no victims, no people that are the perpetrators. But the reality of crime in Australia is far too close to she'll be right, as opposed to let's do everything we can to change the problem. I say this because today the Australian Bureau of Statistics released some crime numbers into the financial year of 2023, 2024. And this is the number of people who police accused of committing a crime. The problem is, despite the fact that there are 340,681 people in just 1 year in Australia who were accused by police of committing a crime, it is not vastly higher or vastly lower than it was the year before, the year before that, the year before that, the year before that, the year before that, the year before that. Instead, it's all basically the same number. Now, certain categories and certain states can be spikes, particularly on things like youth crime. But because it's in and around between 300,000 and 400,000 each and every year, the she'll be right of it all is fingers crossed it doesn't happen to you. As long as those numbers stay kind of where they were last year, then it's okay. But the reality is that, yes, even in a country with 28 million people, there's still 3 and a bit MCGs that you could fill with people who are accused of committing a crime each and every year. Why is that okay? Why is that number okay? Why is that number not being shoved down with the massive public resources that we would deal with things like 1% of the climate change problem? Are you with me here? When you actually break down some of these stats, about a third of all of those crimes were people who committed acts that intended to cause injury. So that is still tens of thousands, nay, almost a little over, somewhere between 100 and 150,000 people who, if they committed a crime, means there's at least one victim on the other side of it. Why is that she'll be right way? 14% when it comes to illicit drug offences, 10% when it comes to theft, and 10% of the 340,000 were public order offences. But all of that together is still not 100% of the problem. It's about 61%. But when these numbers came out today, that 340,000 people had committed a crime, or another 340,000 people were the victims of a crime. Was that anywhere in the 6 p.m. news tonight? Was that the lead story? No. Because, dare I say, the attitude is she'll be right. And we won't be. The same number of panel conversations on television, let alone government money, let alone laws, let alone public attitudes, should be as aggressive about interpersonal violence as it is about intergenerational issues such as the health of the planet. And remember, we're 1% of the world's problem. Another example of when she'll be right, mate, is seemingly okay. It's when politicians win elections because we, the voters, love the F word. And I'm not talking about the one the President used this week.
Free public transport.
Free.
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 Free. Free. Free. Free. Free.
But of course, nothing is free. Someone somewhere is providing a service. The service costs money. And we learned today, again, via some excellent reporting, about the size of the bill that is coming to our generations when it comes to everything being free. The federal budget this year tells us that we are already in $1 trillion worth of debt. Next year it'll be 1.09 trillion. Then it'll be 1.1 trillion. And then by 2028, 2029, so fiscally speaking, within 4 years, we'll be at $1.2 TIFA trillion in debt. And that's just the federal government. Another massive source of debt that we are handing on to our next generation. And if, again, the theory is we must go all in on dealing with climate change because what is not done now will be passed on to the future generations, why does this not apply to the amount of debt that we hand on to future generations? Because I'll give you the tip. She'll be right, mate, turns 1 billion into 1 trillion and 1 trillion into 2 and 3 and 4. And while I'm not suggesting we're about to be Greece anytime soon, in Victoria, in their top 5 things that they spend their money on in their state budget, I think number 3, bigger than some government departments, is paying off debt. So if you keep running a budget deficit, all you do is add to the previous budget deficit, which is the overall amount of debt, which, of course, will eventually be paid over time by future generations. So why is the logic about climate change urgency not being applied to this? Again, today, reporting about state budgets. And state budgets are in a world of financial pain. This week, we got budgets in New South Wales and in Queensland. We've already got one from Victoria and even one from the local council known as the ACT. I'll have a little more to say about that, believe it or not, in a moment or two's time. But in the financial review today, they actually divvied up the amount of money that all of the different state governments owe the rest of the world, and it is almost $1 trillion themselves. So you've got a federal government in $1 trillion up to $1.2 trillion worth of debt, and you've got state governments going from $900 billion on their way up towards $1 trillion on their own. Of course, that makes $2 trillion. Yet no urgency anywhere to deal with this with the same public policy urgency as there would be something like climate change. Again, can I read from the financial review for you? The state government gross debt will surge past $900 billion by the end of the decade, more than triple the pre-pandemic levels, as premiers struggle to rein in burgeoning infrastructure programs and cut back on cost of living support and public servants' wages. State government debt has increased 150% since 2019 to $661 billion, prompting warnings from credit ratings agencies and calls for economists for premiers to reduce their spending. If you prefer things in chart form, here's an example. You can have a look for your state. The blue is the current number. The red is where it is going to be in a few years' time. So it's about $200 billion in Victoria, but it's going to go to more than $250 million in just that one state, $250 billion, I should say. The same, of course, New South Wales. You can see what's happening in Queensland and even in the Northern Territory. Their debt is going to be $18 billion. So if you turned around and you grabbed a calculator, like Saul Eslake did, the independent economist, guess what you will end up finding out? that the independent economist Saul Eslake said the situation in which state and federal government debts per capita stood at $1,800, the net debt per capita was $45,183. So that's per every individual, federal government, state government debt right now, 45 grand. And as we continue to have more deficits, then we will have surpluses. 45 becomes 50, 55 becomes 60, the frog in the pot. So could somebody please explain to me how she'll be right is the acceptable attitude to the debt that we rack up in a country like Australia? Because it's not. If she'll be right is not an acceptable attitude on climate change, how is she'll be right an okay attitude when it comes to debt? How is it okay that in the most recent NAPLAN results, just 1 in 3 students were not meeting, or should I say 1 in 3 students were not meeting the basic literacy and numeracy expectations? As Slim Dusty sang.
She'll be right, mate. She'll be right.
But it won't be. You can't have a generation when a third of those kids, and it's been like this for a decade, are not able to meet the basic standards of education. That's our failure. It's also our failure that almost 3 million Aussies are this close to homelessness. That 3.4 million Australian households will have run out of food by a Thursday each and every week. She'll be right, mate, is not an okay thing, but for some reason it keeps being okay. It's okay on crime, it's okay on poor schools, it's okay when it comes to poverty. But if it's climate change, it must be dealt with absolutely urgently, all guns blazing. But the bit that people forget about She'll Be Right, Mate, is that when you actually listen to the song from which many people know the term, the reality of why you can say she'll be right, mate, is because people with their backs to the wall in this country work their backsides off to fix the problem. Here is the longer version of the song.
Now she'll be right, mate, or she'll be right. Just remember that you're an Aussie and you'll never give up the fight. When your back's to the wall, just give your all. It's morning, noon and night. She'll be right, mate, or she'll be right, that's right.
Just me? Or do you doubt that Airbus Albo is going to have the sense of his back to the wall and giving his all? No. He and the political class have got 4 pay rises since he became the Prime Minister. He and his ministers look like they will govern for a very long time, so will they feel any urgency on schools, on crime, on poverty, or will it only be on climate change? Because that is seemingly the only thing that they think she'll be right, mate, is not the right attitude to have. Now, yes, this week things have come to an end in terms of Israel and Iran, and that is, in my view, because the President drew a line and is trying to hold everyone to the line of the ceasefire. Now, again, we're only a couple of days in, and I certainly hope that we'll still be in the same place by this time next week. But it is not all over in terms of the Australians who have been caught up in this in either of those countries. In fact, according to news.com.au today, evacuations are difficult, specifically from the country of Iran, and there are more than 4,000 people that are registered in both Iran and Israel who would like to come home. These are not people who want to be citizens. These are not people who want protection visas. These are citizens of this country who were in Israel or in Iran for any reason why any of us would be in any other country, from a holiday to visiting their families, and they have every right to come back and to come back with safety. It does seem that there are more people who are wanting to come back from Iran than come back from Israel, and according to the ABC, they profiled a series of people about this today, and they said that Francis is one of around 3,000 Australians and their families that are registered with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the assistance to leave almost 2 weeks after the Israeli bombings. were falling in the capital of Tehran. So yes, I'm glad there's a ceasefire. I loved that the President of the United States was throwing F-bombs around to calm things down. But if you think it's over, there are at the very least 4,000 Australians who would like to come home. I hope that just because this thing will slowly move its way off the front page, that the urgency of the government to get those people out does not fade. Now, I said over and over again during the federal election that your preferences matter, your preferences matter. Because with a third of the country voting blue, a third of the country voting red, there was a third of the country who probably weren't going to get who they wanted, which was somebody other than red or blue. So what you do with your number two matters. And again, I want to pay tribute to the work that's been done by the Australian Financial Review, who actually, along with a bunch of other academics, went through and had a look at how the different preferences broke down. Now, we know the government did not have enough votes to form government on its own. It only got to where it was going because of preferences. So again, as I said about something else this week, they may well have 94 seats and they may well have what looks like electoral support that's a mile wide, but the reality is it's an inch deep. This is what they had a look at, where they had a look at, say, red votes start out as red votes and end as red votes. Blue votes start out as blue votes and end as blue votes. Green votes mostly go to the Labor Party. Orange votes, in terms of One Nation, they, of course, go to the Liberal Party. But there were some fascinating things that they were able to work out. In terms of Greens' preferences, can you believe there's almost 12% of people who walk into a ballot box and say, I want the Greens to be the government, and if they can't be the government, I want the Libs? 88% of their supporter base goes to Labor. But who are these almost 12% of Greens who, if they can't have the Greens, if they can't have Sarah Hanson-Young, they wanted Peter Dutton? In terms of the people who vote for the so-called independents, 67% of their preferences went to Labor. A third went back to the Liberal or National Party. Remember, I told you one of the differences between the 2022 election and the 2019 election was where One Nation preferences went. If they go 50-50, the Libs were in a world of trouble, but the Libs vote was already down. But 3/4 of people who voted One Nation decided to send their preferences to the Libs, but a quarter of people who said, you know what, Pauline Hanson number one, Albo number two. And in terms of the trumpet of patriots, could somebody please tell me how anyone who was voting for the Trumpian net zero is terrible, that a third of those people preferenced Labor? Fascinating to see, isn't it, about exactly where the preferences ended up going. Now, again, it's not challenging the result. It's not pretending something is weird here. It's just, could somebody please explain to me? And if you are one of these people, can you send me an email? Are you somebody who voted number one for the Greens but then went, you know what, if I can't have the Greens, I want the Libs? Are you somebody who voted for the trumpets, the Palmer people, who wanted Albo? I don't get it. I'd love to know. If you're one of them, though, it also gives us a real indication as we start to read the polls about how those will be weighted over the next 3 years. Send me an email, paul@skynews.com.au. Another thing worth mentioning after that federal election was, of course, the over and over and over. You saw that how many times? And you heard this how many times?
Medicare.
Medicare.
Medicare. Medicare.
Medicare.
Medicare.
And the Prime Minister specifically saying,
all they need is this, their Medicare card.
Well, we learn this week that the local council, otherwise known as the Australian Capital Territory Government, which is a majority Labor government, that you'll need your credit card as well if you want to go to a hospital. They made an announcement this week that every single ratepayer in the ACT is now going to have to pay $250 to be able to access a hospital. The tax slug included a new annual $250 health levy, which will be added to rates bills paid by residential, commercial and rural property owners. It will raise $205 million over the next 4 years. quick out of the gate is the Shadow Health Minister, Anne Rushton, who said, among other things, that the ACT's $250 tax essentially is a co-payment for the use of the city's 2 public hospitals. It was outrageous because of so much lecturing from Labor during the campaign that you only need your Medicare card. It makes a mockery of Anthony Albanese's claims that all you need to access healthcare is a Medicare card. When confronted about this little asterisk, that essentially the policy of the federal government was being undermined by the ACT government, Mark Butler said, at the end of the day, that government is accountable to the good burgers of the ACT for the decisions that they take in their budget. Or she'll be right. A couple of other quick things to mention. Do you want to all feel old together? Let's hold hands. 15 years this week since Julia Gillard became Australia's first female Prime Minister. Can you believe that? In 2010, those dramatic days, I remember sitting and being part of the live coverage. It was also bizarre. But literally this week just passed, 15 years since Julia Gillard was sworn in as Prime Minister. Now, for those who, of course, don't really care about their history, this will be particularly offensive, but for those of you who do, never forget that if her finest moment was the misogyny speech, remember it was in defence of Peter Slipper, who had said the most grotesque things about the female form, and that for all of the carrying on about how evil Tony Abbott was for denying us the first female Prime Minister, the one who actually undermined her, the one who actually stabbed her in the back, is the bloke they put back in the job, whose Deputy Prime Minister is Anthony Albanese. And finally, Brett Sutton. Remember Brett Sutton, the former Chief Health Officer of Victoria, somebody who was there all the way through, just nodding and agreeing with every stupid decision that Daniel Andrews had made all the way through those COVID briefings, was more than happy for Victoria to be the most locked down location in the country, for Melbourne to be the most locked down city in the world. The bloke who told us that we had to deny people being able to go outside, especially into things like playgrounds, and we had to have curfews because people were selfish for going outside. This was the bloke who gave a scientific tick to stupidity like that.
Playgrounds are closed. Again, a difficult decision. It affects my family. It affects thousands and thousands of families across Melbourne. But as I said yesterday, the reality is there's a risk of transmission in those settings.
Well, he now works for the CSIRO, and we learned this week that Brett Sutton, the bloke who was trying to say there was something scientific about the stupidity of banning people from being outside, when we knew way back then, even 5 years ago, that being outside was one of the least dangerous places to be. The reality was being inside, in confines, that was going to be more of a problem. And he gave a tick to that sort of nonsense, didn't stand there and call it out as BS at the time. Well, he has a new cause that he is involved with, and we turn to The Age to read about this. For years, Brett Sutton lived on the front lines. Victoria's former Chief Health Officer has scars and death threats to prove it. And now he's trying to do something about it by attempting to launch what he hopes will be a big new player in Australia's science sector, a coalition for trust in science. Quote, "People want to know what is real and what is not real," says Sutton, who is now a director of the CSIRO's Health and Biosecurity Research Unit. "I think we're all stronger by working together." Well, Brett, while I agree with you that we must follow the science, you stood there and clapped on decisions that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with control and everything to do with keeping people locked in their houses. In the case of the poorest of the kids, they were locked in with their abusers. They didn't go to school, and even 5 years later, some of those people have never been back to school. So yes, would I like to see a coalition for trust in science? Sure. Do I think that the bloke who stood next to the North Face jacket man and agreed with every decision he made publicly should be the front person of that? No.